There is a reason the Watchers make people uncomfortable. Not because they are confusing, not because they are symbolic, but because they were once understood too clearly. In the earliest Jewish writings, the Watchers were not metaphors. They were not poetic language. They were spoken of as real, defined beings, known to have crossed a line that was never meant to be crossed. Ancient communities did not ask if the Watchers existed. They asked what went wrong. Their names were recorded. Their actions were described. Their consequences were feared. These accounts were read aloud, copied by hand, and discussed openly, not as myths, not as imagination, but as part of a shared understanding of how heaven once interfered with earth. And for a long time, no one felt the need to soften that truth. But as generations passed, the story of the Watchers began to create a problem, because it suggested that rebellion did not begin on earth. It suggested that forbidden knowledge was introduced intentionally, and it suggested that humanity's corruption was connected to something that descended from above. That implication was dangerous, so the language began to change. What had once been described plainly was slowly reframed. Beings became symbols. Events became allegory. Warnings became footnotes. Not because the story was unclear, but because it was too clear. If the Watchers were only symbolic, why were they defined so precisely? Why were their transgressions recorded in detail? Why does the Bible itself refer to them as Watchers? Observers, beings assigned to oversee, who instead chose to intervene. And why does their story appear at the exact moment Scripture begins explaining the spread of corruption on the earth? Within minutes, you will see why this subject was no longer taught directly, why later generations grew cautious around it, and why the Watchers, once openly discussed, were gradually pushed to the edges of biblical teaching. Because when you understand who they were, you begin to see why their story was never meant to be forgotten, only feared. They were not shadows without names, and they were not chaos without order. The Watchers are described, in the earliest layers of tradition, as specific heavenly beings, assigned, appointed, and entrusted with responsibility. They were not wandering spirits, nor faceless forces of evil. They were Watchers because they were meant to observe, to oversee, to remain above the affairs of humanity, not entangle themselves within it. They had roles. They had boundaries. They had authority that was not their own, but given. Ancient texts speak of them as part of a structured heavenly order, beings who stood between realms, aware of both heaven's design and earth's fragility. Their task was not intervention, but restraint, not instruction, but distance. They were to watch history unfold, not reshape it. And yet, the rebellion of the Watchers was not born out of sudden rage or blind destruction. It was deliberate, measured, intellectual. What they violated first was not the body, but the boundary of knowledge. The earliest accounts are careful here. They do not begin with violence. They begin with instruction, with teaching, with revelation given where it had been withheld before. The Watchers introduced knowledge that humanity was not prepared to carry, knowledge that altered how people understood the world, themselves, and even God. This was not random information. It was power disguised as wisdom, insight without moral weight, ability without restraint. They taught humanity how to reshape creation without understanding consequence, how to extract, to manipulate, to weaponize what had once been neutral. They revealed secrets that belonged to the structure of the cosmos, not to the hands of mortals. This is why the ancient writers linger on what was taught, not only on what followed. Because once knowledge crosses a boundary, it cannot be returned. What came after, the corruption, the violence, the collapse of order, was not the cause of judgment. It was the result, the symptom, not the disease. And this is the part later generations struggled to hold. A theology built only on rebellion through violence is simple, comfortable, easy to explain. But a rebellion rooted in forbidden knowledge is far more unsettling, because it suggests that evil does not always arrive as destruction. Sometimes it arrives as enlightenment, as advancement, as progress without permission. This is why, over time, the Watchers were reduced, flattened, recast. They became generic fallen angels, indistinct demons, figures of chaos rather than custodians who failed their charge. Not because the earlier accounts were unclear, but because they were too precise. A being that teaches forbidden knowledge raises questions no institution can easily contain. Questions about who decides what humanity is ready to know, about whether some truths carry a cost greater than their value, about whether enlightenment itself can become an act of rebellion. And so the sharp edges were softened. The story was simplified. The Watchers were made easier to dismiss. But the ancient record never forgot what the real threat was. Not merely that the Watchers descended, but that they taught. What they revealed reshaped humanity's trajectory. And that is why the story was never erased, only restrained. What exactly did they teach? That answer was never given lightly, and it still is not. If you are still here, listening closely, it means you are willing to confront theology that does not protect comfort, only truth. To understand why the Watchers were once so clearly recognized, we must step into the world that first received their story. A world shaped by what scholars now call the Second Temple period, an era where heaven was not imagined as distant or abstract, but ordered, structured, and alive with hierarchy. Ancient Jewish thought did not flatten the unseen realm into a single category. It understood layers, ranks, assignments, authority flowing downward in deliberate order. Heaven, to them, was not chaos. It was administration. There were messengers. There were princes. There were watchers. Each had a place. Each had limits. Each had responsibility beneath a supreme divine will that could not be challenged without consequence. Within this worldview, the Watchers made sense. They were not confusing. They were not strange. They were not controversial. They fit. Ancient audiences did not struggle with the idea that some heavenly beings were tasked with oversight rather than worship, that some were appointed to observe humanity's development without interference, that obedience, even in heaven, was not automatic, but chosen. What troubled them was not understanding who the Watchers were. What troubled them was understanding what happens when order is violated. Second Temple Judaism carried a deep reverence for balance, for the separation between realms. Heaven was not meant to bleed into earth. Knowledge was not meant to flow freely without permission. Boundaries were not arbitrary, they were protective. The story of the Watchers threatened that balance. Not because it was unbelievable, but because it was believable enough to expose vulnerability within the divine order itself. If beings assigned to uphold structure could abandon restraint, then disorder was not merely human failure. It was cosmic risk. This is why ancient writers handled the subject with both clarity and caution. They described the hierarchy carefully. They emphasized assignments and limits. They framed the rebellion as an exception, not a norm. Because destabilizing the structure of heaven meant destabilizing the meaning of obedience, justice, and divine governance. And yet, the ancient audience understood all of this without strain. They had the framework. They lived in a world where scripture, tradition, and cosmology formed a single language. A world where unseen beings were not dismissed as fantasy, but integrated into moral reasoning and spiritual accountability. It is only later, much later, that confusion enters. Modern audiences struggle not because the Watchers are too complex, but because the framework that once supported their story has been quietly removed. The hierarchy flattened. The unseen realm simplified. The language stripped of its original depth. What was once intuitive now feels foreign. What was once easily grasped now feels controversial. Not because the ancient world believed too much, but because the modern world remembers too little. They understood this easily. We do not. And that gap, the space between ancient clarity and modern discomfort, is where the story of the Watchers begins to feel dangerous again. Because when the framework returns, so does the weight of what the Watchers represent. Not myth, not metaphor, but a warning embedded in an ordered universe about what happens when knowledge crosses a boundary it was never meant to cross. The question that rises now cannot be avoided. Who exactly were the Watchers, and why were they watching? The Bible does not introduce them as strangers. It does not frame them as intruders from nowhere. When they appear in the ancient record, they emerge as beings already positioned, already assigned, already aware of their place within a divine order. They are watching because watching was their role, to observe the unfolding of humanity, to witness the growth of creation without reshaping it, to remain present but uninvolved. This is why their title matters. A watcher is not a ruler, not a creator, not a judge. A watcher sees and restrains himself. And yet, Scripture preserves a moment when restraint failed. Genesis speaks carefully, almost sparingly. It does not linger. It does not dramatize. It simply records that the sons of God saw something, desired something, took something, and the earth changed afterward. The Bible does not need to explain what the Watchers were in detail, because the earliest readers already knew. They understood that the sons of God were not human rulers. They were not poetic metaphors for kings. They were heavenly beings acting outside their boundary. What Scripture emphasizes instead is consequence. Because the moment the Watchers moved from observation to participation, the order of creation fractured. If they were guardians, what went wrong? The ancient answer is unsettling in its simplicity. Desire crossed duty. Watching became longing. Oversight became involvement. Distance collapsed into decision. And if they fell, another question follows closely behind it. Why were they given authority in the first place? Because authority, even in heaven, is not granted without trust. The Watchers were not flawed experiments. They were entrusted roles within a system designed to function through obedience. Their authority was not a test of power, but of restraint. And restraint, when violated, reveals something deeper than rebellion. It reveals intention, which leads to the most difficult question of all. If the knowledge they carried was forbidden, why did humans accept it? The ancient texts do not portray humanity as dragged into corruption against its will. They describe curiosity, hunger, willingness, because forbidden knowledge rarely arrives as threat. It arrives as promise. The Watchers offered understanding before wisdom, power before maturity, insight without the burden of responsibility. And humanity, unguarded and unprepared, received it. This is where the story grows heavier. Because the Watchers did not simply fall from grace. They created influence. They were not alone in what followed. The ancient record hints, quietly but unmistakably, that their rebellion did not unfold in isolation. That what descended did not stop with a single decision or a single group. That the corruption that followed required cooperation, alignment, and shared intent. The Watchers did not act alone. And that changes everything. Because it suggests that the fracture between heaven and earth was not a moment, but a movement. What that movement involved, who else participated, and how deeply it altered the world is not revealed all at once. It is layered, measured, withheld, because some answers were never meant to be given quickly, and some truths, once seen clearly, cannot be unseen. The ancient record does not shout this moment. It lowers its voice. Genesis tells it simply. As humanity multiplied upon the earth, the sons of God saw the daughters of men. They noticed, they desired, and they crossed a boundary that had never been crossed before. From that union came beings unlike any the world had known. Figures remembered not for their virtue, but for their strength, their influence, and their distortion of what it meant to be human. The text does not explain who the sons of God are. It assumes you already know. To the earliest readers, this phrase carried weight. It did not point to kings or dynasties or powerful men. It referred to divine beings, members of the heavenly host, described elsewhere as standing before God, carrying out assignments beyond the human realm. This is the plain reading. Not sensational, not exaggerated, simply stated. But alongside Genesis, another voice preserved the same memory with greater detail. The Book of Enoch speaks of the Watchers descending intentionally, of a collective decision, of oaths sworn together, not in chaos, but in agreement. It describes leaders among them, teachers among them, each responsible for revealing a different form of knowledge: astronomy, metallurgy, enchantments, the cutting of roots, the reading of signs. The emphasis is not on spectacle. It is on instruction. These beings did not merely appear. They taught. And what they taught altered humanity's direction. When these two accounts are placed side by side, a pattern emerges that ancient audiences recognized instantly. Genesis gives the outline. Enoch fills in the space between the lines. Together, they assume a worldview where divine beings exist in ranks, where heaven has structure, and where violation of that structure carries consequence. This is where later theology hesitated. Because if the sons of God are divine beings, then Genesis 6 is not a mythological curiosity. It is a record of cosmic rebellion, a moment where heaven's order failed at the level of trust, not force. And that terrified later interpreters, because this passage does not fit neatly into simplified doctrines. It suggests that evil entered the human story not only through disobedience on earth, but through transgression from above. That humanity's corruption was accelerated by knowledge never meant to be shared. Most modern readers were never taught to read Scripture this way. They were given verses without the framework, words without the world that shaped them, a text stripped of the cosmology it assumed. And so the passage feels strange, dangerous, easier to reinterpret than to confront. But the ancient writers were not confused. They understood exactly what they were preserving. And so, just before the implications fully surface, the tone changes. The narrative slows. The weight settles. Because this is the point where interpretation stops being theoretical and starts becoming uncomfortable. This is where many choose not to go any further. What followed was not immediate rejection. That is important to understand. The earliest Jewish writers did not shy away from the Watchers. They preserved the accounts carefully. They copied them. They reflected on them. They treated these narratives not as fringe speculation, but as part of a shared sacred memory, one that explained why the world bore scars deeper than human disobedience alone could account for. The Watchers were not hidden at the edges of thought. They were integrated. Their story helped answer questions that Genesis left intentionally brief. Questions about sudden corruption, about violence that appeared too quickly, too severely, about why judgment came not only as correction, but as containment. And when the early Christian movement emerged, this understanding did not vanish. Some of the earliest Christian writers quoted the Watchers openly. They referenced the Book of Enoch without apology. They assumed their audiences knew the story. To them, the Watchers explained spiritual opposition, cosmic rebellion, and the need for restoration that reached beyond humanity alone. At this stage, there was no panic, no discomfort. The Watchers were not controversial because the worldview that held them still existed. But something changed as theology moved from community memory into institutional structure. As belief became codified, as doctrine became standardized, as boundaries were drawn, not only between orthodoxy and heresy, but between what could safely be taught and what could not. The Watchers posed a problem, not because they introduced chaos, but because they introduced clarity. They blurred the clean separation between heaven and earth that institutions preferred to maintain. They suggested that divine beings could fail in their assignments, that authority could be misused above as well as below, that evil was not only humanity's burden to bear. This complicated the story, and institutions do not grow comfortably around complexity. So the language began to shift again. Texts once quoted were referenced less frequently. Stories once explained were mentioned only in passing. The Watchers were not condemned outright, but they were quietly sidelined, treated as unnecessary, eventually treated as dangerous, not because they contradicted Scripture, but because they expanded it. The clearer the Watchers became, the harder it was to maintain simple explanations of evil, responsibility, and judgment. If heaven itself had experienced rebellion, then the problem of corruption was far older, far deeper, than most systems were prepared to address. And so distancing replaced discussion. The Watchers were reframed, their actions minimized, their identity blurred. They became shadows of what they once were. The forbidden pivot is this. The danger was never that the Watchers would confuse believers. The danger was that they would make too much sense. Because once clarity returns, it forces uncomfortable questions about authority, trust, and the unseen structures that shape the world. And clarity, when it threatens stability, is often treated as heresy, even when it was once called truth. As centuries passed, the story did not disappear in fire or decree. It faded in a quieter way. The Book of Enoch was not destroyed. It was preserved, carefully, faithfully, but outside the boundaries that would later define the Western canon. Copied in distant communities, guarded in languages few would continue to read, remembered where memory itself became an act of devotion. While the dominant theological centers moved toward consolidation and simplicity, Enoch remained alive at the margins. In Ethiopia, in ancient manuscripts, in traditions that did not feel the same pressure to smooth the sharp edges of the unseen world. For a long time, the Watchers rested there, unspoken, but not forgotten. Then, centuries later, fragments resurfaced. Texts once thought lost were found again, studied, compared, translated, and suddenly, voices from the ancient world began speaking clearly into the modern one, unchanged, unapologetic, and disturbingly coherent. The Watchers had not evolved. They had waited. Scholars recognized the weight of what had been preserved, not because it contradicted Scripture, but because it aligned with its earliest assumptions. The language matched. The cosmology fit. The gaps in Genesis began to feel intentional rather than accidental. And with rediscovery came discomfort, not because the text was sensational, but because it was familiar in ways few expected. It echoed ideas already present in Scripture, yet long ignored. It restored a worldview modern readers had never been taught to hold. The tension returned almost immediately. Why does this still feel dangerous? Why does a text so ancient provoke unease in an age that claims to welcome complexity? The expectation is that rediscovery brings clarity, resolution, closure. But with Enoch, rediscovery reopened questions that had been carefully buried. Questions about the nature of evil, about the unseen hierarchy Scripture assumes, about humanity's place in a story larger than itself. The expectation was that the past would feel primitive. Instead, it felt precise. The Watchers did not feel like relics of superstition. They felt like pieces of a puzzle modern theology had learned to live without, but never fully solved. And so the discomfort returned, not as fear of chaos, but as fear of implication. Because if the ancient framework is restored, then the modern one must be re-examined. And that kind of rediscovery does not bring peace. It brings responsibility. The Watchers had waited centuries for their names to be spoken again, not to disrupt faith, but to remind it of what it once knew. And that reminder still unsettles, because it asks the same question now that it did then. What if the problem was never ignorance, but forgetting? The Watchers, in their original form, were not mere observers of the human story. They were guardians, assigned roles, set limits, entrusted with oversight that stretched beyond the understanding of mortal eyes. To watch, to note, to restrain, that was their sacred duty. They were not meant to dominate. They were meant to preserve the balance between heaven and earth. Each movement calculated, each decision weighed within the framework of divine order. But guardianship carries responsibility, and responsibility carries temptation. The Watchers began to teach. They instructed humanity in ways that were not theirs to give. They revealed knowledge that had been forbidden, the secrets of metallurgy, the craft of warfare, the reading of stars, the manipulation of forces hidden within the natural world. With each lesson, they pulled back a veil meant to remain intact, offering insight without guidance, power without restraint. They became teachers, but teachers of what should not have been taught. And in that act, the line between guidance and transgression blurred. Humanity received what it was not ready to bear, and the consequences rippled outward, touching creation itself. Yet their transgression was not violent in the way we often imagine sin. It was subtler, more insidious. They did not destroy by force, they corrupted by instruction. The act of sharing forbidden knowledge became their rebellion. Their sin was not taking, but giving. They broke boundaries established not by whim, but by necessity. They crossed divine limits that had been entrusted to them, believing that understanding alone justified the act. And in that crossing, the very framework of heaven and earth trembled, because boundaries exist not to restrict, but to protect. Knowledge without permission is not knowledge, it is a burden. And some burdens humanity was never meant to bear. Their roles, their symbolism, their very presence still echo in the questions we ask today. What knowledge remains forbidden? What truths are still veiled because revelation too early can destroy? The Watchers were not myths to entertain curiosity. They were warnings encoded into history, evidence of consequences that reach far beyond individual lives. This is not a story of monsters or legends. It is a record of responsibility betrayed, of authority misused, of the fragile boundary between what is known and what must remain unseen. And the silence that follows is not empty, it is deliberate, a reminder that some truths, once revealed, cannot be unlearned, and that some knowledge carries with it a weight humanity may never be prepared to carry. Do not stop at awareness. To simply know is not enough. To witness is not enough. The Watchers compel us to reckon with understanding, to measure the cost of revelation, and to consider the boundaries that still govern what we see, what we learn, and what we are allowed to know. Even as the story of the Watchers resurfaced, it did not come with a single explanation. Instead, it invited interpretation, and in that space, conflict emerged. One path, followed by many scholars and readers, cast the Watchers as fallen angels. It is a tidy explanation. Rebellion becomes simple. The breach of heaven is moralized. Obedience versus disobedience. Clear, measurable, contained. But in simplifying them this way, we sacrifice precision. We erase the complexity of their roles as guardians, as teachers, as beings entrusted with responsibility that went beyond mere temptation. Fallen angels explain rebellion, but they flatten cosmic nuance. They threaten the intricate hierarchy that ancient audiences understood without question. Another path interprets them as royal humans, kings, rulers, elites who overstepped their bounds. This approach comforts the modern mind. It localizes the problem. It avoids questions of divine structure and focuses on human agency. Humanity is accountable. Heaven remains distant. It feels safer. Yet in doing so, it ignores the worldview that shaped the texts in the first place. It denies the careful cosmology, the layered hierarchy, and the sacred architecture of obedience that framed ancient understanding. The Watchers cease to be what they were and become reflections of our modern anxieties instead of witnesses to an older reality. A third interpretation, often found in academic circles, suggests mythological borrowing, that these accounts were creative adaptations of Babylonian or Mesopotamian stories, imported and reworked. This approach brings comfort to scholarship. It allows narratives to be cataloged as comparative mythology rather than confronting the disquieting implications of divine failure and forbidden knowledge. Yet, it undermines textual consistency. It assumes error or fabrication rather than the intentionality preserved in the texts. The stories of Genesis and Enoch do not read like borrowed tales. They read like warnings encoded into history. Each interpretation protects something. Fallen angels preserve moral clarity. Royal humans preserve human centrality. Mythological borrowing preserves academic confidence. Yet each also sacrifices something. Fallen angels sacrifice accuracy. Royal humans sacrifice context. Mythological borrowing sacrifices the sacred continuity that connects the ancient worldview to the text itself. And this is why the story remains uncomfortable. Not because the accounts are contradictory, but because every attempt to simplify them demands that we abandon some essential truth. The Watchers, their actions, their lessons, their rebellion, they resist reduction. And so, for now, the question remains: who were they really? And what does their story demand of us today? The answer is withheld, not because it is unknown, but because it is too dangerous to give lightly. Even now, the story of the Watchers carries weight that most refuse to confront. In our modern age, supernatural themes are softened, reframed, and often minimized. The cosmos itself is rendered metaphor, rebellion becomes allegory, and curiosity, the very force that once drove humanity to seek understanding, is politely discouraged. Why? Because the implications are too disruptive. To acknowledge the Watchers fully is to acknowledge that the universe is not simple, that divine authority is complex, that some rebellions are not merely human failings, but events that ripple from the unseen world into our own. To confront the reality they represent is to face a cosmos in which obedience is fragile and knowledge carries responsibility that cannot be escaped. Institutions, traditions, and teachings have long sought to filter this truth. Authority controls interpretation. Belief systems are stabilized by omission. Some truths are spoken only in whispers, reserved for those willing to wrestle with them, because the weight of understanding can destabilize faith itself. Yet the story remains. It is filtered, but it does not vanish. It persists in texts, in fragments, in the echoes of ancient manuscripts. And it waits for those who will look closer, who will hold the tension, who will not fear the questions it raises. Curiosity is not a flaw. It is the bridge to understanding. But the bridge is narrow, and not all are willing to cross it. And here is the quiet urgency that accompanies this revelation. The moment we stop asking, the moment we accept only the comfortable, the hidden truths recede once more. They do not disappear, they wait. They wait to be discovered again, patiently, meticulously, until someone dares to confront them without fear. The Watchers are not just figures of the past. They are reminders of boundaries, of responsibility, of what happens when knowledge is given without permission, when curiosity is silenced, and when truths are filtered rather than seen. Truth does not vanish. It is always present, though often concealed, filtered, guarded, deferred. And now, listening closely, you find yourself standing at the edge of that revelation, aware that what has been withheld is not absent, and that the responsibility of seeing is now yours. The Watchers, then, were not fictions. They were not allegories invented to frighten or entertain. They were divine beings, entrusted with authority, placed in the quiet spaces between heaven and earth, appointed to observe, to guard, and to restrain. Their presence was deliberate, their roles precise, their knowledge vast. They were called to watch, yet in doing so, they became the first to teach what was never meant to be taught. This is why they were feared, not for brute strength, not for violence, not for their form or their power alone, but for the knowledge they imparted, for the boundaries they crossed, for the rebellion that followed. They carried insights meant to be restricted, wisdom meant to be measured, secrets that could unravel the fragile order of creation if misunderstood or misused. And humanity, eager, unprepared, receptive, absorbed what should have remained beyond reach. In the eyes of ancient audiences, the Watcher's transgression was cosmic. It was not contained within a single act of disobedience. It was the introduction of influence that could not be undone, the giving of knowledge that reshaped humanity's trajectory. Their sin was sacred, subtle, and unsettling. And yet, even as we recognize who they were and why they were feared, we do not answer the final question. Did their influence end? Did the fracture they caused heal? Or does it continue quietly, imperceptibly, shaping the world in ways unseen? The record offers no simple conclusion. The texts stop before absolution. They pause before resolution. They leave the final judgment suspended, inviting reflection, inviting awe, inviting caution. To understand the Watchers is to walk the edge of revelation, to see that divine beings are not immune to desire, that knowledge without restraint is dangerous, that obedience, even celestial obedience, can fail. And yet, the story does not tell us all. It gives us enough to feel the weight of what was lost, enough to see why ancient audiences trembled, enough to understand why modern readers often turn away. But the full measure of their influence, the extent of what still lingers, remains hidden. The Watchers were divine. They were feared. They were transformative. And the silence that follows is deliberate, a sacred pause, a reminder that some truths, once glimpsed, cannot be contained, even as the questions continue to echo across time. And yet, even as we glimpse the Watchers themselves, the story stretches beyond their singular presence. Were they alone in their rebellion, or merely the most visible among countless beings who occupy the spaces between heaven and earth? The ancient texts hint that the spiritual realm is far more populated, far more structured, than modern readers are accustomed to imagining. Angels, watchers, messengers, and princes move in ranks, each with authority, each with purpose. The Watchers are not anomalies. They are participants in a vast, intricate order, one that Scripture assumes without explanation, one that the earliest audiences understood instinctively. Across other writings, echoes of similar beings appear. Texts from neighboring traditions, Babylonian, Persian, even later Christian apocrypha, speak of divine messengers who guide, who warn, who transgress. They are sometimes called by different names, but their roles resonate: oversight, instruction, boundary crossing. The recurrence is not coincidence. It is a signal that humanity's encounter with the divine is never solitary, never simple. There is a pattern, a rhythm to how knowledge flows from heaven to earth, and how some beings resist restraint while others obey faithfully. This awareness transforms the story. It is no longer confined to a single chapter, a single book, a single event. Genesis, Enoch, and scattered fragments from other texts are not isolated. They are part of a larger tapestry, one that spans cultures, languages, and generations. The rebellion of the Watchers is not merely a historical footnote. It is a lens through which the entire spiritual cosmos can be glimpsed. It asks us to consider: what unseen hierarchies shape the moral and spiritual world? What lessons are encoded in the patterns of obedience and rebellion? And this realization changes how we perceive Scripture itself. The sacred texts assume a populated spiritual realm. They do not pause to explain the existence of multiple hierarchies because, to the original audience, these truths were foundational, undeniable, woven into the very understanding of existence. For modern readers, this feels disorienting. We are accustomed to a simplified spiritual landscape, one angel here, one demon there. Yet the reality depicted in these texts is vibrant, structured, and, at times, threatening in its complexity. This story, then, is larger than one book. It is not simply about transgression, punishment, or curiosity. It is about the architecture of the spiritual world, the interplay between authority and freedom, the consequences of crossing boundaries that were never ours to cross. And it calls us to ask questions that extend far beyond the Watchers themselves. How many hierarchies exist beyond our sight? How much knowledge is intentionally restricted? How does humanity fit within the broader design of creation? Expectation reverses here. The story is not about singular heroes or villains. It is about a cosmic network of watchers and observed, teachers and learners, obeyers and transgressors. And it is within this network that the weight of their actions, and ours, resides, quietly, persistently, shaping the moral and spiritual fabric of the world in ways that remain largely unseen. We are left to wonder, if the Watchers were only one group among many, what else exists just beyond the veil? What patterns repeat? What lessons remain to be learned? And, most urgently, what responsibilities accompany the knowledge that has finally been returned to our sight? And so we arrive at the edge of understanding, where the story of the Watchers refuses to offer comfort or closure. To confront them is to confront the limits of simple faith. Our instinct is to seek certainty, to smooth the edges of sacred texts, to feel secure in the familiar rhythms of belief. Yet the Watchers insist that faith was never meant to be simple. The scriptures that preserve their memory assume a cosmos populated with hierarchy, with authority, with consequences that extend far beyond the human gaze. They do not pause to reassure. They do not soften the edges of rebellion or obedience. Comfort came later, after centuries of translation, omission, reinterpretation. It was the product of human desire for order, for stability, for explanation without reckoning. But the earliest texts were not crafted for comfort. They were crafted for awareness, for vigilance, for the sober acknowledgement that the unseen world is vast, structured, and at times, perilously close to the fragile world of humanity. The Watchers force us to reconsider what we thought we knew. They ask us to measure obedience, to recognize the gravity of instruction, to witness the consequences of knowledge given without permission. They reveal that the universe is not moralized simply, that transgression does not always take the form we expect, that divine order is not always predictable. And so we are left unsettled. We are left with questions that have no immediate answers. How much of the unseen world shapes the visible one? How many hierarchies move in silence, unseen, carrying authority we cannot fully comprehend? What knowledge is still forbidden, waiting for the moment it will test humanity again? There is no reassurance here. There is no tidy ending. The Watchers do not allow the story to resolve neatly. They demand that we hold the tension, that we dwell in the mystery, that we respect the weight of what was revealed, and of what remains deliberately concealed. And in that unsettled space, a quiet understanding emerges. Faith is complex. The cosmos is layered. Knowledge carries consequences. The Watchers were never meant to make us comfortable. They were meant to make us aware. And perhaps, for those willing to see, that awareness is the closest thing to illumination we can hope to receive. But the Watchers were not solitary figures, and their story does not end with them. They were part of a larger order, an intricate network of beings, moving within hierarchies that stretch beyond what we can fully imagine. The texts hint at councils in heaven, assemblies of authority where decisions ripple downward, shaping destinies unseen. They hint at the Nephilim, giants born of crossing boundaries, living reminders of the consequences of forbidden union. They hint at cosmic geographies, realms layered and ordered, yet full of hidden dangers and knowledge we are not prepared to grasp. The Watchers were the beginning, not the conclusion. Their actions, their teachings, their rebellion, these threads weave into a greater tapestry that Scripture only begins to describe. And in this tapestry, every question answered opens 10 more. Every truth revealed exposes deeper mysteries. The Watchers weren't alone, and that leads to an even more unsettling question. What else moves unseen? What other hierarchies influence the world we perceive as solid and orderly? What truths remain concealed, waiting for eyes willing, and perhaps brave enough, to see? And with that, the story does not offer comfort. It does not offer certainty. It leaves us suspended on the edge of revelation, aware that what has been glimpsed is only the beginning of a far greater, more complex, and infinitely more sacred design.